Well, and Lauren, I imagine you obviously weren't on the board when this recently happened with the Trump administration signing the agreement with Brown. I suspect there was some, obviously leadership was a big part of that on Brown's part, and I suspect some very different kinds of discussions and so forth. You've been quoted, at least in the Brown Daily Herald, on the deal before, but I would just, reflect on the university's decision and how it relates to the conversation we've been having around trustees at a university and the challenge of navigating this time.
Yeah. Um, I think that the deal that was struck, so to speak, um, I think I was quoted as saying something like it was the best deal possible under the worst possible circumstances. And what I couldn't say in, a short quote for this student paper doing its job is that it, it's kind of, it is about the deal. I don't love the phrase the deal. It is about the agreement that was made, but it's not about the agreement that was made. It's about the long journey that Brown and other institutions need to embark on to restate the value of higher education. I think it was a given for a certain set of people for whom classical education was a given, that that was the highest goal that you should have, and that that was going to make you a better person, and that by being a more educated person, you were going to be a better person. I think that as the academy sort of fractured and the canon came under appropriate scrutiny for who that canon was for and why it was important, that as new paths for education and the value of education were assumed, but not made for at least 2 or 3 generations, maybe 4 now, of students. And at the same time, I think really what happened is that the value of that education and what it actually does for society, which, by the way, includes grant money, includes graduate programs, includes undergraduate focus at the same time, the value to society was blended, was merged with the price of education. And the value and the price, in my opinion, have gotten out of whack. And there hasn't been a closing of that gap of the price, which is untenable for most people in the world, versus the value that it imbues. And so one is qualitative and one is quantitative. And until we make that qualitative statement have actual, you know, um, value that people can touch, I think it's going to be that path that we all need to be on. I also think that in the fray to make the cost, the quantitative amount, make sense, everyone went in the other direction and said, well, it does make sense because you can earn more money and we're going to teach you how to be pre-business and pre-marketing and an entrepreneur course and all these different things. And that is probably not the longest standing scaffold that will hold up this value for the long haul.
That's an interesting discussion. We could go in a whole different direction with that, Lauren. But we're going to wrap up the interview, and I just kind of amazed at that insight because we often talk about the value of higher education on this podcast, and it's an interesting element that we think something of greater value should cost more, but maybe if we flipped it and it actually cost less in this case, people would value it more in some ways or value it in different ways, as you say, right? As I always tell people that, when higher ed used to cost a lot less, there was less risk at exploring as an undergraduate. And the reason why people have to do pre-professional now is because the cost is so high. But again, probably a subject for a totally different podcast. And before I ask that final question of you today, first of all, I want to thank you for saying the student newspaper was doing its job, because I think there's a lot of trustees at colleges and universities everywhere who hate the student newspaper. And as a former editor of the student newspaper at my undergraduate institution, I thank you for saying that.